This is one of what we call a post-resurrection appearance. And it says 11 disciples. That means that for 3.5 years they had been discipled. These are discipled ones. This is graduation. This is graduation day. Yes, they went with him from the beginning. They were through him. He, rebuked them. He encouraged them. He taught them. He showed them how to do everything. He even sent them out on a couple of training missions where a couple of times they failed, or another time they came, oh man, even the demons are listening. And Yeshua rebukes them and kind of tells them to settle down. Meanwhile, the 11 disciples set out for Galilee, to the mountain where Yeshua had arranged to meet them. When they saw him, they fell down before him, though some hesitated. Yeshua came up and spoke to them. To who? To the 11 disciples. That is crucial, to the 11 disciples. And he said, all authority in the heavens and on earth has been given to me. Go, therefore, make disciples of all Gentiles, baptize them in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teach them to observe all the commands I have given you. And know that I am with you always, yes, to the end of time, to the end of the age, the olam ha-olam, to eternity. Now, what's interesting, as we said, is that this mountain is just right north of Tiberias. And if you're going around the horn there in Tiberias, and you get to a little place called Nof Ginisar, and that is where Mount Arbella is at. Mount Arbella is right by Tiberias, and it's a very steep mountain. It actually has a cliff, and you could get through it by going through Tiberias. You go by Tiberias, and then you go around, and then you could go to the top of the cliff. It overlooks Tiberias, the city of Tiberias. And this is Mount Arbella. Today, it is the same way it was in Yeshua's time. Nobody's built the building there. Nobody has done anything there. The rocks are still there, the same rocks, and they're almost like stadium seating. The rocks that are there. And this is where Yeshua sent them out. This is what we call the Great Commission. But the Great Commission was only for 11 men. It wasn't for every person, the multitudes, even for the 70. It wasn't for the 120. It was just for the 12 men minus Judas, which is the 11 disciples, discipled ones. And he tells them, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations. The word there in the Greek is ethnos, where we get the word ethnic. The word ethnos in Greek is the same word in Hebrew, goyim. Goyim. The goyim are the nations. So Yeshua says, make disciples of all nations. But the word that we use today for nations is the word Gentiles. The Gentiles. Now what's interesting is that every one of us needs to reach. Reach. We need to upreach That's what we do when we praise and worship. When we praise and worship, we are upreaching. We're reaching up to Adonai. We're reaching towards Him. Right now, and in many of the ministries of the congregation, we are in reaching. We are reaching each other with prayer, reaching each other with teaching, reaching each other with all kinds of stuff. But we also need to outreach. To outreach is this part right here. To go into the world and make disciples of Gentiles, of every Gentile person that's out there, which means all the ethnic peoples of the world. Every ethnic people, every nation. And there are hundreds of nations out there. Every Gentile, and today, because we don't understand that Gentile means nation and nation, we gotta say the Gentile nations. It's like, is it the Gentile nations or the nations Gentiles? Or the Gentile Gentiles? Or the nations nations? We need to outreach to every Gentile. But who and what did these 11 men outreach them with? We call it the gospel, the good news. The good news is not the nations teaching the nations. The good news is the Kehillah of Yeshua. Remember he said, I will build my Kehillah and the gates of hell shall not prevail. He says, I will build my what? My Kehillah. The Kehillah of Yeshua is the Israel of Elohim. Israel and the Kehillah are the same. Now, the word Kehillah is the Hebrew word that is used throughout the whole Torah and Tanakh. And the Kehillah is the assembly of Yahweh. The word Kehillah means the assembly, those that have been called to assemble for Yahweh. The Greek word in the New Testament is the word ecclesia, where we get the word in Spanish, iglesia. That's a good translation. Iglesia in Spanish is a good translation. It's a perfect translation. The word church in English is a rotten translation. The word church comes from the old Scottish word kirk, and it means a circle. It means a circus. That's where we get the word circus from. And Stonehenge is probably one of the oldest churches, circles of paganism that there is. But it is through the King James Bible, it is through the Old English that the word church comes into the into the English language from the Greek and from that pagan background. It's the King James that brings it into our common vocabulary. But the common vocabulary is wrong. So what we call the church, the ecclesia, the Kehillah, and Israel are the same thing. They are the same thing. So the Kehillah of Yeshua that he built, and he builds it from the remnants of the Kehillah of Yahweh. The Kehillah of Yahweh is Israel. Now let's go ahead and look at this in a diagram here tonight so we could understand this. The most important thing, and go to Jeremiah 11, 15, and 16. In Jeremiah 11, 15, and 16, what do we read? There we read this. Jeremiah 11. And let's start with verse 15. Jeremiah 11:15. What is my beloved doing in my house? Now, his beloved is Israel. What is my beloved doing in my house? She is playing the hypocrite. Can vows and consecrated meat rid you of your guilt? Am I to make you clean because of this? A spreading olive tree, so fair, so sturdy, was the name of Yahweh for you. But with the roar of a great wind, he sets its foliage on fire. Its branches are going to burn. And Yahweh Sabaoth, the Yahweh of hosts, who planted you, who planted Israel? Yahweh. Has decreed disaster for you because of the crime of the house of Israel and the house of Judah have committed, provoking me by burning incense to Baal, to the Lord. The word Baal means the Lord. And what's interesting is Yahweh is upset because they're building, they're into idol worship to the Lord Baal, to Baal, and the Lord. Adonai is upset with Israel. But watch what he calls Israel, my beloved, a spreading olive tree, so fair, so sturdy, was the name of Yahweh for you, was the name of Yahweh for you. But with the roar of a great wind, he sets his foliage on fire. Its branches are going to burn. And in a sense, here's the olive tree of Israel. I'm not a good artist. But all of a sudden, he says that he's going to burn those branches. Now, he's going to burn the branches. But the olive tree itself is going to remain. By the way, always remember about an olive tree is that an olive tree has roots. The root system of the olive tree is, first of all, Adonai. The root system of the olive tree is Adonai. And yeah, there was some branches. And the root system of the olive tree and the trunk, by the way, is Torah. And the patriarchs, Yahweh and the patriarchs, he's the one that built them with Abraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov. And this is the olive tree of Israel afterwards. And of course, there's all this bunch of dead branches. The dead branches is what has become Judaism. The Pharisee system and all the Sadducees and all that, that's the dead branches. And what's interesting is when Yeshua came, all of a sudden, when Yeshua came, there was this olive tree, but it had mostly been broken up. In fact, Peter and James and John and all those guys were pretty much mostly over here. Paul was over here. Peter was over here. In fact, the ones that were over here were Zechariah, Elisheva, John the Baptist, Joseph, Miriam, Nathaniel, in whom there is no guile. He was, the olive tree was very, there was others, but it was a very skimpy. It was a beautiful olive tree, but because of idolatry, the branches were cut off. In fact, it turned out that, almost everyone died out. John the Baptist, Mary was the only one that was left. We don't know whatever happened to Joseph. And one thing about an olive tree, when you cut an olive tree, the olive tree resurrects. The olive trees that you guys saw over there, those weren't there in the time of Yeshua. They weren't there in the time of Yeshua. What happened is the Romans in 70 AD, what they did is they cut every tree around Jerusalem, and they burnt everything, and they used the wood to siege works. And all of a sudden, what happened? Boop! A little netzer. What a netzer is like a little growth. You know how when you cut a tree down, it gets netzers, a little twig. That's called a netzer. Well, of course, Mary died. So the only netzer that we really have is Yeshua. He is the netzer. In fact, throughout the Tanakh, he's called the what? The netzer. Nazareth, and by the way, this is not the same word as Nazarite. A Nazarite is something else. A Nazarite is someone who has a vow of not to cut their hair and not to eat grapes or wine or anything from the vine. For anything from the vine, fermented or unfermented. In fact, you could even eat grapes. A person that took the vow of a netzer could not even eat a grape, could not even eat raisins. So this is a netzer, which is a twig that grows. Now, Yeshua says, I will build my kehillah. I will build my kehillah. In fact, Simon Johnson asked him, when Yeshua asked them about, who do people say that I am? Oh, you're the prophet. You're John the Baptist come from the dead. Simon Johnson told him, no, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living Elohim. And what did he say to him? You are rocky, right? I'm using the actual English words. You are rocky. You are Peter, right? Because Peter means what? Rock, But remember, his name was Simon Johnson. Because remember, Simon's son of Jonah. So Simon of Jonah today would be Johnson. Do you guys know anybody Simon Johnson? Yeah. I'm sure there's a lot of them. Okay. But you are the Messiah, the Son of the living Elohim. Flesh and blood has not revealed that to you, but my Father in heaven. So you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my kehillah, my assembly. Now what's interesting is that when Yeshua came, he actually came to Peter over here, and Peter was a dead branch. Remember, he was a dead branch? He says, get away from me, Master. I am a sinful man. Well, the only people that are here are sinful people. They're cut off from the olive tree of Israel. But what Yeshua did is Yeshua regrafted him into himself. The true descendant of Abraham, Isaac, Yaakov, the true descendant of Israel. Yeshua is the true descendant of every messianic prophecy. He is the son of Elohim. He is the Messiah. And Yeshua came and he built his kehillah, and he added 12 branches that he regrafted from the tree. Later on, he regrafted 70. Later on, he regrafted 120. At Shavuot, there was 3,000 that were regrafted. Remember, they were regrafted. They were Jews. They were Jews. The 12, the 70, the 120, the 3,000 were all Jews. So all these 100% Jews of a remade Israel out of Yeshua, grafted coming from that tree, and now we have a new Israel, the Kehillah. This is the Kehillah of Yeshua. This is the Kehillah of Yeshua. The Kehillah of Yeshua is the same Kehillah of Yahweh from top to bottom, with exception that anyone who isn't tied into Yeshua is dead branches. The Pharisees were here. The Sadducees were here. Paul was here. In fact, Paul had to be regrafted. Paul had to be regrafted. He was dead in trespasses and sin. In fact, he says, I used to be in that company of the dung. Remember? He talked about that. And then one day, here is the wild olive tree of the Gentiles. Here's the Gentiles. And the Gentiles are who? The nations. And there was one branch over here. His name was Cornelius. And this branch really loved stuff that had to do with Israel. There was something about Israel, that this branch called Cornelius, a Gentile, a Roman, really loved Israel. And what happened is that Adonai showed him, and Adonai showed that branch called Peter that had been regrafted about, and they came together, and all of a sudden Adonai cut this branch off. Cut. We need to know, cut this branch called Cornelius and grafted it in over here. Now, one goy from one goy, one Gentile from one nation, from one Gentile nation, now becomes part of the Israel of Yeshua, the Israel of Elohim. So now one Gentile, the rest 100% Jewish, but now we have a Gentile. And we have his family came over and others came over. But remember, they had to be cut from here. What the Great Commission is Yeshua telling 11 men to go over here and become like the Gentiles. He didn't tell them to come and be Gentiles. He didn't tell them, go Gentilize yourselves so that you could reach more people. Gentilize yourself. No. You're cut and you are grafted in here. Now, these guys are supposed to make disciples. Supposed to make disciples. So now these guys are disciples. These guys are disciples. When someone comes over here, this guy that comes over here has to be like these guys. He can't stay like he was. He has to now come over here and be like these guys. That's what discipleship is all about. Yes, sir. Oh, definitely that's a transformation. That's a major transformation, to be transformed. It's what we would call today in a paradigm shift. People would call that a paradigm. So there has to be this paradigm shift from who we were to who Yeshua is. By the way, these guys have to be transformed too. If these guys aren't transformed into what this is, see, this is the Kehillah of Yeshua. This is the assembly of Yahweh. These guys, and here's the key. Remember what Paul in Romans 11, 15, and 16, isn't it interesting? It's Jeremiah 11, 15, and 16. And Romans 11, 15, and 16, both of those talk about the olive tree. Romans 11, 15, and 16 talks about the olive tree, about the Gentiles that have already been grafted in. And remember, by this time in Rome, a great majority of this tree had become Gentile now. And the Gentiles were acting a little bit superior to the Jewish originals. The Johnny-come-latelys were acting more superior, and Paul has to tell them, wait a second, remember, Gentiles, you do not support the tree. The tree supports you. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, Cornelius, when Cornelius was over here, Cornelius was a Roman, and he was a centurion, and he was living in Caesarea. You know that when you went to Caesarea and you saw all that, think of it, this Cornelius was the centurion there. That was his post. And so Cornelius's family, he must have had primos back in Rome. And so what happened is later on, when Paul goes to Rome and he writes letters to Rome and passes through Rome to Spain. Paul went to Spain, but yeah, Spain, Rome is where he writes the letter to the Romans. The book of Romans, apart from it's a letter, it's not a document, it's not a theology book, it's not a history book. A lot of theology, biblical theology comes out, but it's really a letter to the people in Rome. And 3 chapters, Romans 9, 10, and 11, Paul devotes to the Jewishness of the gospel. And so the book of Romans is so important, 9, 10, and 11, for this. But think of this. These guys here are cut off from the olive tree, which means they're cut off from the roots and they're cut off from the sap. When you cut a branch off, it has no life. It dies. The sap is what gives the tree life. The sap is the word of Elohim and the ruach of Elohim. The word and the spirit of Elohim is the sap that the ruach brings. And without that, all you have is the words of men. By the way, the Mishnah was written by these guys. The Talmud was written by these guys. All the Midrash is written by these guys. Now, these guys here are void of the Ruach. The cut off branches of Israel are void of the Ruach, and they're void of the covenant, the Brit Chadashah. Now, Yeshua brought the new covenant. So this tree is the new covenant. This tree is the gospel. This is the Kehillah. These guys don't have none of that. The cut off branches of Israel do not have none of this. In fact, the cut off branches of Israel are living without a covenant. They're not in covenant with Adonai. Adonai is not in covenant with them. They are not in covenant with Adonai. Not even the first covenant. They're not even in the Mosaic covenant. Because remember, Adonai, when he makes a covenant, he joins the first covenant with the second covenant, with the third covenant, with the fourth covenant. In fact, with Abraham, he made many covenants with Abraham. With Isaac, with Yaakov, with David. Adonai is always making covenants. And they're all stacked up on each other. It's not this one, oh, I'm in that one. No, he stacks them up. And you have to go from bottom to the top. The last covenant that we have is the new covenant. When Yeshua raised up the cup, this is the cup of the new covenant in my blood. Those that partake of that covenant are now members of the olive tree of Israel. If you don't partake of Yeshua's cup, you might be taking cups. You might know the word, you might know Hebrew, you might know the Torah portions, but remember, you're not in the covenant. This is the covenant tree. The Kehillah is the covenant tree of Israel today. Adonai is only doing business with those that are in covenant. Adonai is only doing business, transactions, listening, giving advice, talking, doing things for those that are in here. And it's not this. What happened is after the disciples died, this tree pretty much has died over the last 2,000 years. And I don't have enough room, but all of a sudden, a hybrid tree kind of grew up. And a hybrid tree is called the church, Christianity. This is Christianity. Christianity has aspects. It's trying to get in this root system, but it also is in this root system. It wants to be this, but it wants to be this. That's a hybrid. And Adonai doesn't like hybrids. Adonai, he says when you make a clothes out of cotton or wool, not wool and cotton, you don't plant this, and this. You plant this, and you plant that over there, and that over there. You don't sow your field not so, but you make what do you call it? With an ox and a donkey. Plow with an ox or a donkey. You don't drive a Chevy hybrid car. It's illegal. It's not kosher. Anybody here have one? Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Yes, sir.
Pastor, can you explain to me, I totally agree, Adonai does not like hybrids, but you just mentioned the covenants as being stacked upon each other. That to me sounds like a hybrid of covenants.
Oh, that's not at all. Because it's like we rededicate our lives all the time. And say you get married. You, even before you were married, say you dedicated your love to one another. But then you do the actual covenant, you get a ring, and you get married. And for your anniversary, many of you have done remarriages. Not that the first one was no good, okay? Not that the first one wasn't valid, but to rededicate your life. And in fact, some of you have gotten rebaptized. It's not hybrid. It's just that you're stacking, you're getting closer and closer. And every covenant that Adonai does is he adds and he gives you more. He gives you more. It's almost like we call it also progressive revelation, because every covenant does not replace the former one, it adds to it. The former covenants have not been replaced. One of the aspects of what is called replacement theology in Christianity, replacement theology began with the Catholic Church, and it continued with the Reformed churches of the Lutherans, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, and the Church of England, in that the first covenant of Moses was taken away and made obsolete by the new covenant of Yeshua. So the church, and I'm talking not the body of believers, but the church as organized in national and or denominational groups, in these cases the Catholic Church as an organization, has replaced Israel, which is impossible. Israel cannot be replaced by a nation, by a people, by a denomination, by a group of people that says we are now the Kehillah of Adonai. Now we are the Israel of Elohim. The Catholic Church did that and said the Mosaic Torah is obsolete. It is not obsolete. It's still viable. It is still alive and well. Now the Lutherans came. The Lutherans says, oh, the Catholics aren't real Christians. We are the new church. We are the real Israel. The Presbyterians say we are the real. All these groups say we are the real Israel. But that's not true, because all those are hybrids of the true church and Gentile paganism. Yes, ma'am.
So, if they all believe they're the true church and the olive tree, how do you tell them they're not?
Well, part of the way, I probably won't tell them you're not. When I was a seminary professor, one of the things that I had is a lot of pastors that were coming to get their doctorate degrees and stuff like that, and so I would teach stuff like this in our classes and on church history and stuff like that. And I was very careful when I drew these. In fact, this was a little part of one of my doctoral dissertations on the olive tree of Israel. And I had to defend it in front of these guys that were part of that hybrid. And I didn't fight against them. In fact, when I taught this, a lot of them said that makes sense. But like with everything, what can we do about it now? In fact, one of the things that we're going to talk about tonight, as this is introduction to, is about Christmas. And just like they all said, well, wait a second. I tell them, Christmas is part this, Yeshua, but the majority of Christmas is that over there. That means that the church today, and this is the real example, is that the church today, here's Yeshua. born on the first day of Tabernacles. Here is Jesus, born on December 25th. Now, it's the same person. It's really not the same person, but it's supposed to be the same person. But all of a sudden, here's the hybrid. And the hybrid is the one that everybody's following today. In fact, most people don't know the real one because they're following the hybrid. How do you tell them? Well, you know what? Which is, you guys are going to be doing this from now for the next couple of weeks. And when is Christmas? Next week? Monday. So people are probably going to ask you, why don't you celebrate this? Why don't you give gifts? Why don't you have a Christmas tree? Why don't you do none of this stuff? Say, well, wait a second. I'm not part of the hybrid. I'm part of the tree, the Israel of Elohim. Again, they could get mad, or they could say, well, you know, you're being arrogant or whatever. But it's true. This is what I'm, you know, when you go home tonight, check these verses out, and you'll see that what this drawing represents is true. It's there. You can't. No one could fight against this illustration. In fact, I welcome anyone to say, that's not what it says. Yes, sir. One. Okay. What's wrong now? Oh, okay.
To make sort of a different analogy, it seems like the church is like trying to graft an orange branch onto an olive tree.
Yeah.
It derives life from the sap, but it bears really bizarre fruit.
Yeah. And like Paul says there in Romans 11, contrary to nature. Because in nature, you cannot get a wild and put it on the good. You actually get a good and put it on the wild. Yes, sir.
Going back to the covenants, the original question, the way I like to view the covenants is they're like layers of a foundation. So the first covenant is the bottom layer of the foundation. So if you're building any structure, you can't remove that foundation and just keep building it. And so that's kind of what I see a lot of the Christian churches try to do, is they try to start erecting a new structure on a different foundation. So the question I would ask them is, what foundation are you building upon? And if the answer isn't the Torah, isn't the trunk of the tree, then they're starting something new.
But they will already believe they are because of Jesus, who they call Jesus. They already believe that they're basically arrived because they believe in Jesus.
Yeah, they do, but like you said, that's an excellent, illustration there. Let's see, 1 and 2. Well, the word Brit Chadashah in Jeremiah 31:31, the word Brit is the word covenant, a Brit. Chadashah is the new, but the new, several places in Scripture, also represents something that has, it's the same word that is called like in the new moon. By the way, everybody see the new moon? Okay, it wasn't seen at Israel last night, but it was seen tonight in Israel. It was seen here last night, but remember, it's not here that we proclaim the new moon. It's in Israel, in Jerusalem, that they proclaim it. So today is the day 1. It's not day 2. Some are already calling it day 2 because it was seen in this hemisphere before. It was seen in Israel, but it appeared. Every month, the new moon appears, but the word, the Chadashah, new, could also mean a reappearance and or a renewed in the sense of it's the same thing but renewed. And here's where like the illustration of the covenants come in, is like you could have a truck, and that truck could be renewed. It could be made new. It's not replaced, but there's things about it, like for example, my brother's 64 Chevys. My brother has all kinds of 64 Chevys. How many do you have? 3, 4, 5. 2 working. But anyways, some of the things that I see now that they're doing is that they actually have new components for it that in 64 they didn't have. And so they make for better gas mileage, better things. And so you renew it. It's the same car. It's the same VIN number. But it's a brand new restored car. This is the point that the book of Hebrews makes. A lot of people have problems with the book of Hebrews because it uses the word better several times. It even says the word, it's a better covenant. And it is. The Brit Chadashah, the renewed covenant, is a better covenant. But it's not better in the sense that that one had to be replaced. The first one isn't replaced. It was remodified. Here was the blood of bulls and goats, the book of Hebrews says. Here is the blood of Messiah. Well, it's still the same covenant of blood, but now the blood of Messiah, which is an eternal covenant of blood, is better than the blood of bulls and goats, which had to be done every year. Now, this isn't going to stop, by the way. The Mosaic covenant of sacrifice is not over. The only reason there is no Mosaic sacrifice today is because we don't have a temple. That's the only reason. If we had a temple right now, if the Romans hadn't destroyed the temple, we as believers in Yeshua would still be sacrificing. We would still be sacrificing in the temple in Jerusalem when we would go over there. How do we know that? Because Paul, after the resurrection, after him preaching the gospel all over the world towards the end of his ministry, is still sacrificing himself. Plus, when Yeshua comes and rebuilds the temple, by the way, there is a third temple that is going to be built here shortly, maybe in our lifetime. And the sacrificial system is going to start there. That's the one where the anti-Messiah is going to come and proclaim himself to be Elohim. But when Yeshua comes back, if you read Isaiah 40 and following perfectly, if you read it carefully, I should say, you will see that the sacrificial system is restarted in Yeshua's temple. Yeshua is going to be the high priest. He's going to be the prince. And the high priest, Prince Yeshua, King Yeshua, our Messiah, is going to be in charge as the high priest of doing the sacrifices. And so that system isn't over with. If that system would be over with, then we would say, uh-oh, no more Torah. Because remember, everything has to continue, especially in the millennium. In the millennium, the whole Torah as it was supposed to be, which probably has never been followed exactly by Israel to 100% accuracy, in the millennium, the Torah is going to be 100% activated and followed by all the nations of the world, all the Goyim, all the Gentiles, are going to be following Torah throughout the whole world. And the whole world is going to be under Torah. Okay, anything else on this? Yes, ma'am. Yes, yes, yes. There's still going to be sacrifices for sin, because remember, the sacrificial system in its original form was never meant to take away sin. It was meant only to cover sin. See, a lot of people don't realize what atonement is. The word atonement, Yom Kippur, means to cover. This is a kippah. It's a covering. Kippur means to cover. And like I always use the same thing with Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve sinned. They're full of guilt and shame. The sacrificial system is a grace system. Judaism, in replacing the sacrificial system with works, changed that. The Catholic Church and other Christian churches replacing the sacrificial system of Israel with their ways has replaced that. What people don't realize is sacrifice is grace. Sacrifice is not payment. Sacrifice is grace. Because when Adam and Eve sinned, Adonai sacrificed an animal not to pay for their sin, but to literally cover their sin. So the sacrificial animal, the lamb, that Adonai was the first sacrificer. Remember, he was the first sacrificer. The first person to sacrifice was Adonai himself. And he killed the lamb. Innocent blood was shed. And like I always say, what did that cutie little lamb do except be cutie? An innocent little lamb was killed. Innocent blood was shed. Adam and Eve didn't pay nothing. Adonai got the skins and covered their guilt and shame. By grace, like I always say, by grace he gave them those skins. By faith they received them and put them on. That is their salvation by grace through faith. Everything is always by grace through faith. So the sacrificial system of Moses, and of course from Adam, people sacrificed. Noah and Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they all sacrificed. But in Moses, we have it written down that when we sin, to cover our sin, to cover it up, we sacrifice an animal. Blood covers sin. Without the shedding of blood, there is no covering, no atonement for sin. It just covers it. And once a year, all the sin that had been covered is taken away by Azazel into the desert, and the new altar is free again. And the next day, it starts filling up until next year, and next year, and next year, and next year. Yeshua, behold Yochanan the priest. Remember, John the Baptist was a priest. Someone that could tell what a clean, kosher lamb would be. Behold the Lamb of Elohim who covers our sin? No, who takes away the sin of the world. And so the sin of the world has been taken away. The world is without sin. Yeshua paid the penalty of the world's sin. All the world has to do, and this is the good news, all the world has to do is say, I accept that. But because they will not accept that, they say, without them say, they say, no, I want to pay for my sin in hell for all eternity. Well, That's bad news. But the good news is all you have to say is, I accept what Yeshua did for my sin. He who knew no sin became sin, that I who knew no righteousness should be the righteousness of Elohim. And so up to now, when Yeshua brings in the new temple in the millennium, the people are going to come and sacrifice for sin, for covering. Because the Torah is in existence. The Torah is not in existence right now. We're really are following Torah, but we can't follow the whole of Torah because we don't have a temple, we don't have a priesthood, we don't have a king. So we can't follow every aspect of it. But at all times, we should follow that which we can at that time. Even the people in Israel could follow more things than us in exile. But when Yeshua comes, Yeshua is that. And by the way, let's go to that. I'm sure there's going to be someone who's going to ask, wait a second, where are you getting that from? Go to the book of Ezekiel. And we are going to look at Ezekiel chapter, I believe it's what, 45? Yes, 45. And look at, let's say, 45, beginning in verse like 13, around there. Let's say verse 16. Let's just do 16. Let all the people of the country be subject to the due for the prince of Israel. The prince is to make himself responsible for providing. Now, please underline that, because I don't know what that means. I don't know what that means, but watch what it says. The prince is to make himself responsible for providing the holocaust, oblations, libations for the feasts, the new moons, and the Sabbath. That means that the feast, the new moons, and the Sabbath are all going to be in existence. For all the solemn festivals of the house of Israel, the 7 solemn festivals. He is to provide the sacrifice for sin, oblation, holocaust, communion sacrifices, atoning for the house of Israel. So atonement is still going to be there, covering for a year, for 1,000 years. But remember, he paid the penalty of sin. Whoever believes in him, his penalty of sin is paid. What we do today, we do the same thing, but we don't kill a lamb. What do you do when you sin? Well, first of all, do people sin today? Do people sin? Not you. Lester Dean, do you sin? Every now and then. More then than now. Every one of us sins, right? What do we do? What we do today is we come in confession. We still sin, and we come in confession. Technically, if we had a temple, we would come, and when we bring that lamb, we would be confessing our sin. What makes stopping from sin and repenting from sin today is that many of us don't understand death and the pain and the hurt of death. And watching a little lamb die, killing a little lamb, is painful. It's painful. It hurts. Just thinking of that little lamb, helpless. Just thinking of that little lamb, and we kill it for food. And we don't sacrifice today, but we kill it. We kill animals today, not for sacrifice, but to eat. Anybody have a hamburger today? A hamburger? If you had a hamburger today, an animal was killed. If you have a chicken today, if you had a fish, whatever animal you had today, it was killed. The thing is, today we don't see it. When we were small, we saw it, or at least some of us. We would see, our uncles or grandpas or, grandmas, have a matanza. By the way, there's a really interesting story about the matanza with Sephardic Jews that's very interesting that I was studying on. But anyways, today we don't have that. We don't have that. So think of every time you sin, if you had to confess, not by coming on an altar call, not by just saying, Father, forgive me, but by actually taking a lamb to the priest. That's a whole different culture. We in America, we in the last 2,000 years have never had that. But because we haven't had a temple, even our Jewish brothers that are still into Judaism don't have that. Because we don't have a temple. But remember, Paul sacrificed several times after his being born again. Not to pay for sin, but because the Torah said. When Paul took his Nazirite vow, there in the book of Acts, he actually paid for the sacrifices for himself and the other Nazirites that were taking the Nazirite vow. Those are sacrifices that had to be paid. He put money not only for his, but for their sacrifices. They went to the temple and he paid. He had to cut his hair. He had to do the ritual that Torah says for the Nazirite with sacrifices. This is after the resurrection. This is after him being born again. He didn't do that. Well, I'm sure he did it when he was not born again, but after he was born again, he did it. Let's stop here for more questions. Yes. Where it says, the prince is to make himself responsible for providing the Holocaust. Now the prince is Yeshua. He's the high priest. So Yeshua is going to make himself responsible. Well, what I don't understand about that is, does that mean that he's going to buy him? Or is he going to sacrifice them? Because they are going to be sacrificed. There's going to be a sacrificial system. Even for sin, it says. Did you guys see that? It says, sacrifice. He is to provide the sacrifice for sin. Well, wait a second. He is the sacrifice for sin. So how could he provide the sacrifice for sin in a temple with an altar, with the priests and everybody doing their sacrificial Levitical work? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This is future. This is in a Messiah's temple. This is Messiah. This is Yeshua. He will be responsible. But wait a second. He is the Lamb who took away the sin of the world. But, see, always remember this. And this is different than the Christian way of thinking, the Greco-Roman way. The Greco-Roman way is the idea of it has to be this way or that way. The Hebraic is that I do believe that Yeshua died for my sin, and my sin is paid, and my entry into everlasting life is solely because of Yeshua's payment. But because of this scripture, I also believe the other side of the coin. I don't understand it, but I'll accept it because it's written that in the future, the sacrificial system is going to be started again. I could, even though those are opposites, I'm not confused by them. Don't get confused when there are two things in Hebrew in the Torah, or because remember, the Hebrew Bible, Genesis to Revelation, is the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible, or the Bible of the Hebrews, could give you two things that are opposites, and they could still be both true. You can't do that in Greek. You can't understand that in Greek. Just like with his name, with his nature. Adonai's nature is plural and singular at the same time. See, the pagan world only understands the plurality of the gods. Mohammedanism only understands the absolute singularity of the God. But Elohim, Yahweh Elohim, is not pagan or absolute monotheism, so it could be both at the same time. Yes, sir.
I think what it doesn't say here is that the prince does not sacrifice for himself. He's already done that one time. Again, for all the other sacrifices.
Yes, sir.
That basically what we have, and this might be a way of helping to explain it to Gentiles. I was reading in Romans 2, it says, all who have sinned outside the framework of the Torah will die outside the framework of the Torah. So if you reject Torah, if you reject Messiah, you die.
Correct.
And all who have sinned within the framework of Torah will be judged by Torah. You're not dead, but you're judged. It says, for it's not merely the hearers of Torah who God considers righteous, rather it's the doers of what Torah says who will be made righteous in God's sight. For whenever Gentiles who have no Torah do naturally what the Torah requires, then these, even though they don't have Torah, for themselves are Torah, for the life shows the conduct the Torah dictates is written in their hearts. And so for the Gentiles, the mishpatim, the moral law that they can see, consider enacting the Torah, but we should be reading and enacting the entire Torah to get the most benefit in terms of sanctifying our lives for God.
Correct, yeah. Yes, sir.
How is Yeshua going to administer this? Is it going to be one appointed place and time in the temple in Jerusalem? Or is it going to be throughout the earth and who's going to authorize the nations to this?
Only one place in Jerusalem. Everybody will have to go, all the nations will have to go to Jerusalem or send representatives. If a representative isn't sent from a particular nation, that nation won't have rain, for example. So everything is going to be administered out of Jerusalem. But we here, for example, will be the administrators throughout the land. In Yeshua's parables of the talents and all the different parables, he talks about how some are going to rule 10 cities, some are going to be ruling 5 cities, some could be ruling 1 city, depending on our works, depending on, for example, 1 Corinthians 5:10 and following about the way hay, wood, and stubble in the house built. Our rewards are rewarded, the reward system of works. See, we're not in salvation system of works. We're in a salvation system of grace. But we are in a reward system of works. Our rewards are by our works. Now, if you try to switch them out, we get bad theology. So we have to say salvation is by grace, but rewards are by works. Rewards are not by grace. They're by works. And so, you know, and I kind of already, I'm thinking Maui and Lahaina, and, you know, some of these cities already. I already got my Google Maps of some of these cities. I don't know what cities, you know, some of you guys have already.
Pastor, what I don't understand, though, I believe that entirely, that the sacrificial system will be re-implemented. What I don't understand is Yeshua walking perfectly himself would have taught Torah to his disciples, and he would have said that the sacrificial system is not obsolete. But he himself, being perfect, would not have to have done a sacrifice. So he would have been there to watch it or oversee it, and that would have been a major heresy to the Sadducees and Pharisees of that time, but it's not written anywhere.
Correct.
Why did, and in the Lord's Prayer, he's saying things about pray in this way and forgive our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. I don't see the enforcement of that, though I believe it. I just want to know how to explain that.
One of the important things about Yeshua is that if Yeshua would have come to a Gentile community and wanted to bring the Gentile community into the gospel, he would have had to start from the beginning and taught them about sacrifice, taught them about all that. But he didn't. He came to his own people, Israel. All the people that he talked to, the 12 disciples, the 70, the 120, the 3,000 that came afterwards, all these people already knew Torah from when they were small. Yeshua did not come to teach Torah because he came to a Torah observant community. Yes, there was people that were teaching false things, and the ones that were teaching false things, that Yeshua, when he rebukes the Pharisees, he says, you all have made the Torah of Yahweh obsolete for the sake of your tradition. That means that Yeshua was Torah observant. He believed in the Torah. His disciples that were listening there could say, yeah, now the Sadducees and the Pharisees, they were the ones that were outside the gate. Yeshua and his disciples, in fact, when he says, I have other people, Cornelius and company and others, who are from other places, I'm going to bring them into one sheepfold, and there will be one shepherd and one sheepfold. So Yeshua is bringing them, the Gentiles, here. The Pharisees got mad because he knew that he was telling about them when the subjects of the kingdom, they will be pushed out. So they knew, the Sadducees and the Pharisees knew that he was talking about them, and Yeshua made that line clear that we are Torah observant, you guys are not. But he didn't have to teach the Torah to these guys. What Yeshua came to do is bring the good news of the gospel of the kingdom. Remember, and this gospel of the kingdom, not the gospel of Baptist, not the gospel of Catholicism, not the gospel of denominationalism, of the Christianities, but the gospel of the kingdom. The gospel of the kingdom is over here in Ezekiel. Part of that gospel of the kingdom is a temple. I will destroy this temple and build it up in 3 days. Yeshua was not only talking about his physical temple, which he did in 3 days, he resurrected, but he's also going to establish the millennium, a new kingdom, a temple, the kingdom of David. Yes, sir. Oh, yes. Yes. Yeshua, well, the aspect of David the Messiah, and this has been a is David going to be raised up to be the prince, or is David the surname of Messiah, the name that Messiah goes by, my servant David? Several places throughout the prophets talk about my servant David, the root of Jesse, but it's not talking about David himself, it's talking about Messiah. So is it possible here, when the two sticks are united? By the way, this also shows us that the two sticks will be united not now, but in the millennium, when David is going to be the prince. So there's a lot of groups now trying to talk about the two houses, the house of Judah and the house of Israel, and they're trying to bring all that up. That won't happen till the end. That won't happen in the millennium. The two sticks are going to come together. The two sticks will not come together until the millennium. And at some point right before the millennium, during the 7 years, we don't know, because the chronology of the book of Revelation is not really established absolutely. 144,000 from the 12 tribes are going to be raised up again. And that will be the beginning of the reunification of the 12 tribes. But not now. So if you hear someone saying, oh, I'm from the tribe of Issachar. Oh, I'm from the tribe of Dan. Oh, I'm from Reuben. Don't believe him. If they say, well, I'm French, so I'm Reuben. Oh, I'm Celtic, so I'm Dan. I'm English, so I'm Ephraim. Don't believe him. You know, if they tell you, oh, you have a nice, bubbly personality, you must be from Naphtali. Oh, this brother there, he's always mean and he's always mad. He must be from the tribe of Dan. Don't believe him. So there's all kinds of people today talking about the tribes. Everyone today, as far as we know, the only tribe that's available today is Judah, with Benjamin in it and with Levi. But of all the other tribes, no one could say, I'm from this tribe or I'm from that tribe. So if someone has already told you or taught you that there's all these tribes available depending on, you know, who your great-great-grandfather was in the old country, in white Europe, don't believe it, because it's what we call a WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, that are saying we are the new Israel. Don't believe them. Now, I saw a hand. Yes.
So, in the millennium, when there's going to be the sacrificial system again, like Yeshua went through, does that mean that we're still going to be sinning and in covering?
Well, not us, because we will already be resurrected immortals. But the people living in the land will be sinners, because there's going to be sinners that are going to go into the land at the end of the tribulation. Right. Right. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Yes. Yes. In the millennium, there's no amount that we could say. There's going to be a remnant of all nations that are going to go in. A remnant of Jews, a remnant of all kinds of people. And at that point, you know, probably that whole group will be believers, because they've just seen the resurrection of us, and they've seen all this stuff happen. But say 1,000 go in from every nation. Well, most of those people could live the whole 1,000 years. To die, you know, what does it say? I can't remember now. To die at 100 is to die like a baby or something like that. So they're going to multiply. Always Adonai always says, be fruitful and multiply. So at the end of the millennium, at the end of 1,000 years, there's going to be thousands of people. Most of those, some of those, well, probably the majority of those will not be believers, but they will be observers. Because remember, you don't have to be a believer to be an observant person. We see that in any religion today. But these people will be observant because Yeshua will be ruling with a rod of iron. So they'll do, they'll follow Torah. But at the end, when Satan is let loose, he's going to go and capture their minds, and their true colors are going to come out. And that's when Yeshua is just going to get like a fly swatter and boom, and they're gone. Well, let's stand. Father, we thank you for the opportunity for tonight. And we pray that each one goes to home. And I pray, Father, that everyone has more questions than when they came in, Father. And that we could go home and search the scriptures to see if these things be so. We bless you in Yeshua's name. Amen. And we do have a basket here in case anybody wants to give an offering. You are welcome.